Corporate Board Member presents an informational webcast. On this edition, Non-CEO Chair Compensation Trends with T.K. Kerstetter, President of Corporate Board Member, and Jane Romweber, Partner and Senior Consultant, Meridian Compensation Partners.
Welcome. I'm T.K. Kerstetter, President of Corporate Board Member, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this Board Informational Webcast. We're going to be talking about non-CEO chair compensation trends. And joining me to discuss this topic is Jane Romweber, who is a partner with Meridian Compensation Partners. And welcome, Jane.
Thank you.
We've had the chance to do this before, and it's a pleasure to have you back.
Thank you.
So the first thing I want to talk about is Meridian had the opportunity to do a study in this area. So I wonder if you can sort of talk about undertaking that and then what some of the results were.
We undertook this study because there's a lot of focus on the non-CEO chair role, which is to say separate roles for chairman of the board, not from the CEO position. And it can be a little bit of a mystery why these roles are paid the way they are. Also, they're not easy to survey because they can be paid in lots of different ways, and so we decide that every 3 years or so it's good to put some focus on it and see what the trends are.
Well, there certainly is, you know, that role is changing so much, so you really have to give consideration to, you know, how do you attract and reward a job that is changing so significantly in the skill sets that are needed.
That's true, but what we find is that this is highly incumbent driven. For instance, we survey 3 different types of non-CEO chairs. They may all have some duties that are exactly the same, but they're unlikely to have a complete exact same set of duties. For example, if you tell me that a chair is a former CEO of that company and is paid as an employee, the chair pay median in our sample was $3.7 million. That's about 10 times the amount as if the same person were paid as a director or were a completely independent person to that company paid as a director.
When you did the study, what sort of universe did you use to make sure that you had a good cross-section of data?
We focused on the largest 500 companies in the U.S., and partly because they provide a good sample set, and partly because we had done a survey of a similar set 3 years ago, and we wanted to have perhaps not a constant sample, but something akin to that to see what the trends are. We excluded some directors, some non-CEO chairs from our pay sample. For instance, if they were chairs of a master limited partnership or a company had signaled that they were separating the roles but hadn't named a chair yet, we didn't have any pay to look at. And if an executive chair, meaning a former CEO at the same company who was being paid as an employee, if that person had been in the role less than a year, we didn't look at the pay for that for fear that it would encompass some CEO pay. So we dropped those out of the pay sample, but we left them in the full sample for prevalence.
What was significant? What was the most significant finding or trend that came out of the study?
The main prevalence trend is that there's a 5% increase in the number of non-CEO chairs from the last time we did the study, which was 3 years ago. Interestingly, that's only 1.8 percentage points higher. It's a 5% increase, but it only increased to 36% of the sample. The other very significant trend is that the number of executive chairs, those are the ones who used to be CEOs of the same company and are paid as employees, that number decreased by 30%. And the number of independent chairs, paid as a director and never been an executive of that company, increased 75%. So now the number of independent chairs exceeds significantly the number of chairs who used to be CEOs. We thought that was a significant finding.
The sample, though, covers a tough period in time. I mean, when you look at what happened in the economy and whatever, so the 5% probably isn't a huge surprise, correct?
No, we expect it to keep increasing because of the influence of shareholder activism. You know, arguably, there's no really great reason not to split the roles, except that perhaps it just doesn't seem to suit the people at that company and on that board. And we did find that many independent chairs came into their roles when there was a swap out of the CEO. And that makes a lot of sense because then the personality issues are less fraught.
How about other findings? I mean, that was your most significant. What about other findings that the study gave you?
Well, one fascinating aspect is how much movement there was. So, for example, I said that there was a 5% increase, but what there really was more of a 30% increase and a 25% decline, because some companies went backwards. They went from a separate position to a combined position for 100 different reasons, a lot of them incumbent driven. Perhaps the chair resigned from the entire board or retired off of it. Perhaps there was a new CEO who had different qualities and wanted the chair role, and they decided to accommodate him. Sometimes the chair was an ex-CEO, and that person went back into the CEO role. So it was fascinating how much movement there was. We saw companies that might have an executive chair in '07, now they have an independent chair. Different people, of course, but for 100 different reasons.
Well, we know that companies are spending a lot of time evaluating splitting the roles. We look at what's happening worldwide. We don't have to look too far. We can look at the UK on what's happened relative to that. But what else interesting did you find sort of with the non-CEO positions?
One interesting aspect is that the pay is moderating. It increased, and you ask, well, how can both of those be going on? Well, the medians increased, but the 75th percentiles came down. And that the suspicion would be that companies aren't as willing to stand out in the crowd as they might have been at one time. Perhaps boards wondered why a non-CEO chair needed to be in place. I'm sorry, an executive chair needed to be in place for a very long time. Perhaps it could go to an independent chair with fewer pay issues. So that was interesting. And this happened both at the executive chair level and the independent and director chair level. The independent and director chairs, of course, are paid as directors. Their pay came closer to each other. And the 75th percentiles came down in one instance and up in the other, so that they met at about 200,000. The median now is about 150. This is incremental pay for independent and director chairs.
So we're finding out more and more about this non-executive chair position. I'm sure the study will help give some reference. But because it's not that well known, what else is still unknown about that position?
We wish we knew a lot more of the whys. If you read proxies, you can get some clues. For instance, one large company just signaled that its independent chair was leaving the board. It was time for him to roll off, and they wanted to retire the CEO and bring in a new one. So independent chair is going away. CEO will become an executive chair, and they'll get a new CEO, and all this is disclosed in the proxy, so you kind of get the background. Other times, we really don't know. We really don't know whether it's personality, situation, crisis, shareholder activism. We don't really know, and that's the fascinating aspect.
Yeah, still a lot to learn about that maybe the study helps a little bit, but there's still some unknowns.
Yeah, some of that, of course, companies don't really want to put into writing. It can get personal, but pay likely will stay incumbent-driven to a certain extent. Another thing that we didn't study in the work we did, but it comes out as an issue, is who's going to decide? Has a board set itself up in terms of leadership to be able to have the right people make these decisions so that everything is proper and good decisions can be made and the company can go forward without too many issues of personality?
So when we summarize this topic, how would you summarize it for a viewer on what they should take away from this particular topic?
Clearly, the separation of roles is on the uptick, not the downtick. Independent chairs are clearly becoming more prevalent, and their pay is much narrower in range than, say, the pay of a executive chair. So that you're talking, somewhere from what a lead director might make up to maybe $800,000 in incremental pay, with 150 as a median and 200 as the 75th percentile. But you're going to be somewhere in that range, and the 800,000 is very much at the high end.
Well, we will look forward, Jane, to reading more about the study. I'm sure there's going to be places. If somebody wanted to get more information on that study, is there some place that they can go?
Yes, it's on Meridian's website, www.meridiancp.com, and I'd be happy to send it to anybody, Romweber@meridiancp.com.
That's great, Jane. Thanks for joining us. And that will conclude this informational board webcast. We hope that you'll join us again when we look at another important topic that will help you be a better director. So thanks for joining us.
Jane Romweber can be reached at jromweber@meridiancp.com. This has been a presentation of Corporate Board Member, an NYSE Euronext company.